All right, so every single country out there runs on a unique operating system. We call it a government, and it dictates pretty much everything, right? From your rights to what's in your wallet. But here's the thing, these systems are not all created equal, not even close. So let's dive in and figure out how the world is really run. So, when you think about a country's leader, what pops into your head? Is it a king inheriting a throne, a president that, gets elected by the people, or maybe a prime minister picked by their party? Just that one title, king, president, prime minister, it's a massive clue that helps us unlock the entire system they're working in. And that's exactly why thinking of a government as an operating system is such a perfect way to look at it. Seriously, it's like the hidden code that's running in the background, controlling everything from the laws and the economy to the rights each and every one of us has. And today, we're going to decode that system. Okay, so we're going to break this all down by asking four really important questions. First, who's actually holding the power? Second, how much control does the government really have? Then we'll get into how the whole thing is organized, and for the grand finale, what would it look like if there was no government at all? All right, let's kick things off with the most fundamental question you can possibly ask about a government. Who's in charge? I mean, really, who's calling the shots? The answer to that one question tells you if power is concentrated in the hands of just one person, a tiny little group, or the people themselves. So you can basically split this into two big camps. On one side, you've got systems where all the power is concentrated in one place. Things like monarchies, autocracies, oligarchies. And on the other side, you have systems where that power is spread out among the people. That's where you get your democracies and republics. Let's dig into what each of those actually mean. So first up is monarchy. This is probably the one you're most familiar with. It's ruled by a king or a queen, and power gets passed down through the family line. But, and this is a huge but, there's a massive difference between the types. You've got symbolic monarchies, like in the UK, where the monarch is more of a figurehead, and then you have absolute monarchies, like in Saudi Arabia, where the ruler has all the power to make decisions. Now, autocracy, this takes that rule by one idea and really cranks it up a notch. Here, you have one person or one party with supreme, absolute, totally unchecked power. Whatever they say goes. Their decisions are the law, and there's no way to challenge them. And as you can probably guess, this almost always means civil liberties get completely crushed. A classic and pretty chilling example of this is the Soviet Union under Stalin. Okay, then you have something called an oligarchy. It literally just means rule of the few. So power isn't in the hands of one person, but a small, super elite group. And how do they get this power? Well, it usually comes from either having a ton of money or controlling the military, not from being born into the right family. And it's interesting, the source material points out that some people argue the US today is a kind of oligarchy just because of the huge influence that massive corporations have on our politics. All right, let's flip over to the other side, rule by many. Now, you hear the words democracy and republic thrown around all the time, sometimes like they mean the same thing, but there's a really important difference. Think of it like this. In a pure democracy, the citizens themselves are the rulers. The majority vote decides everything. In a republic, the state is seen as belonging to the people. It's public property, and the people elect representatives to make the big decisions for them. The key takeaway? A country can actually be both. In fact, most are. Okay, so we figured out who holds the power. Now for the next logical question, how much power do they actually have? We're talking about the scope of government control. How deep does it reach into the economy and into the day-to-day lives of its people? The best way to picture this is as a spectrum of control. On one end, the limited end, you've got constitutional governments, where a set of laws, a constitution, puts strict limits on power. As you move along that spectrum, you get to socialism, where the government steps in to control the distribution of goods to try and create equality. Go even farther, and you find communism, where the state has absolute control over all the resources. And then at the most extreme end, you hit totalitarianism, which is, well, total state control over every single aspect of life. So, with socialism, the main goal, at least on paper, is equality. The idea is that workers can still own their own personal property, but the central government takes charge of distributing all the goods and services to make sure everyone gets a fair slice of the pie. The biggest knock against it, though, is the potential lack of incentive. I mean, think about it. If everyone's going to get the same outcome anyway, what's the motivation to work harder than the next person? And that brings us to the most extreme end of that spectrum, totalitarianism. The name itself was actually coined by the fascist leader of Italy, Mussolini. In a totalitarian system, the state's control is, well, total. It's not just about managing the economy or politics. No, it goes way deeper. The state tries to control what you think, what you believe, and what you value. The clearest modern-day example we have of this is probably North Korea. Okay, quick recap. We've talked about who rules and how much they rule. So now let's get into the practical side of things, the real nuts and bolts of how governments are actually structured and organized to, get stuff done. So a really common way to set things up is with the federal government. This is where you divide power between a main central government and smaller regional ones like states or provinces. The sports analogy for this is perfect. Think of a head coach. They set the overall game plan, but they delegate specific jobs to their assistant coaches. The head coach is the ultimate authority, but the assistants have control over their own little domains. The United States is a classic example of this in action. Now, when you look at democracies, the leadership structure usually comes in one of two main flavors, presidential or parliamentary. The biggest difference right off the bat is the executive branch. In a presidential system, like what the US has, the executive is completely separate from the legislature. But in a parliamentary system, the executive is actually chosen from the legislature. The leader of the party with the most seats usually becomes the prime minister. And this creates a really interesting trade-off, stability versus flexibility. A president serves a fixed term and is really hard to get rid of, which brings stability. A prime minister, on the other hand, can be booted out with a simple vote of no confidence. That makes the system way more flexible and responsive, but maybe a little less stable. So, we've gone through all these different ways to build and structure a government. But what if the best structure is no structure at all? What if the answer is just no government? Well, that brings us to the pretty radical concept of anarchism. Let's be honest, when most of us hear the word anarchy, our minds immediately jump to chaos, riots in the streets, total disorder, right? But that's actually a huge misconception. The real core idea of anarchism isn't about chaos at all. It's about the complete absence of a central government. The philosophy is that people are perfectly capable of governing themselves by working together voluntarily. So after going through this whole menu of options, from an absolute king all the way to no government at all, you have to ask the big question, right? Which one of these systems is actually the best? Well, the simple and maybe frustrating answer is there isn't one. Because in the real world, countries are almost never just one of these things. They're all complex hybrids, a mix and match of different ideas. Take the United Kingdom. It's a constitutional system and a monarchy, and it's parliamentary. The United States, it's constitutional, federal, a republic, and has a presidential system. So really, you should think of these terms less like rigid boxes and more like Lego bricks that countries use to build their own unique structures. And all of this leads us to one final, really interesting question to chew on. Every single one of these systems we've talked about was designed for a specific time and place. But our world is changing, and it's changing fast, with new technology, with new social values. So what does that mean for the governments of tomorrow? What new forms might we see? What will the operating systems of the future actually look like? Now that's something to think about.